Snow. The deadly silence of the Ardennes, broken only by the condensed breath of men hidden among frozen trees. It's December 1944, in the dense forests separating Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. A German soldier, Hans Müller, watches the sky through the treetops, his eyes reflecting the only certainty left after 5 years of war. The knowledge of his enemy's weapons, the predictability of explosions, the precise calculation between the sound of the projectile and its impact on the ground. A brutal yet familiar mathematics. In his diary, recovered decades later, Hans wrote, "We know our enemy, we know their weapons. This familiarity, even in horror, gives us a strange comfort." Little did he know that, in the coming hours, this last certainty would be violently ripped from his reality. The first whistle cut through the air. Hans and his comrades ducked, waiting for the impact on the ground. That second between sound and explosion that allowed them to gauge the distance. But the impact never reached the ground. A deafening explosion occurred 10 meters above their heads, scattering shrapnel in a lethal radius, maximizing damage in ways a direct impact never could. The terror wasn't just physical, it was cognitive. What had just happened defied everything those men knew about artillery. It was as if the sky was watching us, as if the bombs knew where we were, another soldier wrote in his account. What they were witnessing, without understanding it, was the first large-scale use of proximity fuses, an American technological innovation that transformed conventional shells into devices capable of detecting the proximity of the ground or targets via radio waves, detonating at the moment of maximum impact. Jung teaches us that when confronted with the inexplicable, the human psyche resorts to deep archetypal patterns to process the experience. In Man and His Symbols, he explores how encountering the unknown evokes reactions that transcend the rational, activating unconscious structures that shape our perception of the event. For those German soldiers in the Ardennes, the airbursts weren't just a technological advancement. They represented the materialization of a primal terror, the enemy who sees the invisible, who strikes the unreachable. German military reports from that week recorded a 38% drop in defensive effectiveness. But behind that cold statistic lay a devastating psychological reality. Survivors' testimonies spoke of a supernatural dread, of combat-hardened men reduced to states of paralysis or uncontrollable panic. One officer described how veteran soldiers, hardened by years of war, suddenly refused to remain in open defensive positions even under threat of punishment. This reaction transcended mere tactical fear. What we witness here is what Jung would call an encounter with the technological shadow, the hidden side of human progress that, when revealed, awakens ancestral terrors. Technology, in this context, isn't just a tool, but a numinous symbol that challenges our illusion of control over the world. Imagine yourself in that frozen forest. Every projectile's whistle now brings a new dimension of terror. There's no longer that second of predictability between sound and impact. The explosion could happen at any moment, anywhere above you. The very air becomes your enemy. This experience evokes what Jung would describe as an encounter with the archetype of chaos, the dissolution of known structures, the rupture of the world's predictable order. In interviews conducted with German prisoners captured in the Ardennes, American intelligence officers recorded surprising accounts. Some soldiers sincerely believed the Allies had developed some kind of thinking bomb or eye in the sky. Others spoke of technological witchcraft or conspiracy theories involving exiled Jewish scientists seeking revenge. These fantastical narratives precisely illustrate the process Jung describes in Psychology and Alchemy. When the mind cannot integrate an experience through existing conscious structures, it resorts to mythical or magical explanations. The psychological impact was so profound that it even affected German military strategies. Documents recovered from military archives show that, in the following weeks, units were instructed to avoid concentrations in open areas, even when it meant abandoning vital strategic positions. General Heinrich Kittel, captured in January 1945, admitted during interrogation, "Your air-bursting shells did more damage to our troops' morale than any other weapon. They created the feeling that there was no longer any safe place, that the sky itself was against us." This sense of a hostile sky connects directly to what Jung would describe as the activation of the archetype of divine judgment, a superior, inescapable force that observes and punishes. In the psychological context of German soldiers already confronted with the growing evidence of atrocities committed in the name of their nation, this technology seemed to confirm a deeper level of truth. The final reckoning was coming, descending from the heavens. Dream reports collected from German veterans decades later reveal recurring patterns. Skies transforming into watchful eyes, suspended explosions that never reach the ground, sensations of being observed by invisible forces. These are symbolic manifestations of a trauma that transcended the physical to be inscribed in collective memory as an encounter with the technological numinous. Proximity fuses, developed at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory under the ultra-secret codename POSIT, represented a quantum leap in warfare technology. Using a small radio transmitter inside the warhead, the device emitted waves that, upon reflecting off nearby surfaces, altered the return frequency, triggering detonation at the ideal moment. For American scientists, it was applied mathematics and physics. For the German soldiers experiencing its effects without understanding its principles, it was like hostile magic. Let us know in the comments what you think about this relationship between technology and psychological terror. Have you ever witnessed an innovation that initially seemed incomprehensible or frightening? This cognitive rupture perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of the autonomous complex. When a traumatic experience detaches from normal consciousness, taking on a life of its own in the unconscious, influencing future thoughts and behaviors without the individual understanding the source of that influence. German veterans of the Ardennes frequently reported open sky phobias that persisted for decades, without making the conscious connection to those initial experiences with proximity fuses. What we witnessed in that frozen forest wasn't just a technological advancement changing the course of a battle. It was a moment of alchemical transformation of the collective psyche, where the encounter with the unknown forced a profound reorganization of meaning structures. Jung teaches us that it is precisely in these moments of rupture that consciousness has the opportunity to expand, integrating aspects of reality previously inaccessible to conscious understanding. As January 1945 progressed, the psychological reality of the German soldiers in the Ardennes transformed as drastically as the battlefield itself. Walter Brenner, a Wehrmacht military doctor, documented in his clinical diary increasing cases of what he called sky neurosis. Soldiers who refused to sleep in open areas, who developed nervous tics upon hearing any sound from above, who reported recurring nightmares of invisible eyes watching them from the firmament. "They come to me not just with shrapnel in their bodies," Brenner wrote, "but with fragments in their souls. Something fundamental was broken in their understanding of the world." This observation, made by a military doctor with no knowledge of Jungian theories, precisely echoes what Jung would describe as the fragmentation of the ego in the face of a traumatic encounter with archetypal contents. Proximity fuse technology didn't just wound bodies, it shattered the psychic structure that allowed those men to make sense of their reality. Survival accounts from this period reveal surprising adaptations. Entire units developed improvised protective rituals. Some soldiers carried small mirrors, believing they could confuse the bomb's sensors. Others developed elaborate aerial camouflage systems, interweaving branches and fabrics above their positions. From a technical standpoint, these measures were ineffective against proximity fuses, which operated via radio waves, not vision. But psychologically, they represented desperate attempts to restore some sense of control in the face of the incomprehensible. A document recovered from German Army communications archives reveals that, by mid-January, three main theories circulated among the troops about the functioning of the American magic bombs. Some believed they contained small automatic pilots. Others suspected some kind of human heat detector. And a third group was convinced that the Allies had developed bombs that could eavesdrop on German conversations and detonate upon detecting the sound of the language. This last theory led to documented cases of soldiers refusing to speak aloud in open areas. Jung teaches us in Psychology and Alchemy that when confronted with the inexplicable, the human psyche attempts to transform it into something assimilable through symbolic projections. The fantastical theories about the functioning of proximity fuses precisely represent this alchemical process of the mind, the attempt to transform the terror of the unknown into something that can be named, understood, and therefore potentially controlled. A particularly notable story emerges from the reports of the 5th Panzer Division. A young soldier named Friedrich Keller, after surviving a particularly devastating artillery attack with proximity fuses, began to claim he could feel when the bombs were about to fall. His comrades, desperate for any advantage in the face of the inexplicable terror, began to follow his instructions on when and where to take cover. Surprisingly, his platoon suffered fewer casualties in the following weeks. The officers, initially skeptical, eventually allowed Keller to serve as a kind of improvised oracle during the bombardments. From a Jungian perspective, we can interpret this phenomenon as a case of synchronicity, the acausal connection between psychic and physical events. Keller's traumatic experience may have sharpened his perception of subtle environmental patterns that preceded the attacks, creating a bridge between his conscious and unconscious that manifested as a seemingly supernatural form of intuition. As the Battle of the Ardennes drew to a close, with German defeat imminent, something profound had changed in the collective psychology of those soldiers. Reports from deserters crossing Allied lines frequently mentioned the terror of the intelligent skies as a factor in their decision to abandon combat. A British intelligence officer observed, "They fear these new weapons in an almost superstitious way. It's not just a rational fear of death, there's something more primal in their terror." If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming analyses on the psychology of war and technological innovations that transformed historical conflicts. What Jung would show us, if he could analyze these accounts, is how technology, when sufficiently advanced and misunderstood, takes on numinous qualities in the human psyche. Proximity fuses weren't just physical devices for those soldiers. They had transformed into modern manifestations of ancient archetypes: the vigilant eye, the relentless judge, the punishing sky. This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of the transcendent function, the process by which the psyche attempts to integrate seemingly irreconcilable experiences, creating a bridge between the known and the unknown. In February 1945, a crucial transformation occurred in the psychological response of German soldiers. What was once incomprehensible, and thus imbued with supernatural qualities, gradually began to be integrated into a new structure of understanding. Documents recovered from German military intelligence archives revealed that Wehrmacht scientists had finally deciphered the basic operating principle of proximity fuses. A technical memo distributed among officers, but rarely reaching common troops, explained, "The American device uses radio waves to detect ground proximity, similar to the Gamma system we developed for anti-aircraft radars." This moment represents what Jung would call the threshold of integration, the point at which the encounter with the unknown, initially traumatic, begins to be assimilated by consciousness. However, statistics reveal something surprising. Even after the technical explanation became available, the psychological impact of proximity fuses remained virtually unchanged among the troops. A survey conducted with German prisoners of war in March 1945 showed that 72% still believed there was something supernatural in the functioning of those weapons. This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of archetypal constellation, Once an archetypal content is activated in the psyche, its emotional charge and symbolic meaning persist even when rational consciousness offers alternative explanations. The smart bombs had become, for those men, more than just weapons. They were living symbols of the collapse of their worldview. One of the most impactful accounts from this period comes from Klaus Schroeder, a young officer commanding an anti-aircraft battery. In his diary, recovered decades later, he wrote, "I understand now how our ancestors must have felt when thunder roared in the skies. We know it's technology, not magic, but does that matter when you're lying in the snow, looking up, waiting for the sky to decide your fate? There are moments when science and myth become indistinguishable." This almost poetic reflection from a young officer precisely mirrors what Jung describes in Man and His Symbols when speaking about the numinous experience, the encounter with forces that, even when intellectually understood, evoke emotional and psychic responses that transcend the purely rational. The proximity fuse had become a bridge symbol between the modern technological world and humanity's primordial experiences in the face of uncontrollable superior forces. Medical reports from this period document a 58% increase in cases of what they then called combat fatigue, what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Particularly notable was the emergence of a specific pattern of symptoms. Soldiers who, even in safe environments far from the front, would enter a state of panic upon hearing sounds from above, throwing themselves to the ground or seeking cover. A military doctor wrote, "It's as if the sky had become permanently hostile for these men. Even the sound of a door slamming on an upper floor of a building could trigger extreme terror reactions." Jung would teach us that these symptoms represent the crystallization of trauma in the form of an autonomous complex, a psychic structure that separates from conscious control and continues to influence thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, often throughout the individual's life. A particularly fascinating aspect of this period was the emergence of mythical narratives among the soldiers. In interviews conducted with veterans decades later, researchers documented recurring stories of technological angels, beings supposedly inhabiting the skies over the Ardennes, capable of instantly judging friend from foe. These narratives frequently incorporated elements of traditional Germanic mythology fused with contemporary technological terror, a perfect manifestation of what Jung calls a cultural complex, where collective trauma is processed through inherited mythical structures. The psychological impact of proximity fuses far transcended their objective military effectiveness. Military experts estimate that this technology increased the effectiveness of Allied artillery by approximately 40% against troops in open fields. But its true multiplier effect came from the psychological impact. Entire areas became practically unusable for German forces, not because they were physically impenetrable, but because they became psychologically unbearable. Share this video with anyone interested in military history or psychology. These connections between technology and the human psyche are rarely explored in conventional history books. What we witnessed in the Ardennes was a profound historical irony. The nation that had incorporated technology as an expression of its cultural supremacy, that had transformed the machine into an extension of national will, now found itself psychologically disintegrated by the encounter with a superior technology it could neither comprehend nor control. Jung would show us that this moment represents a collective form of what he would call the encounter with the shadow, the painful but potentially transformative confrontation with that which has been denied, underestimated, or projected onto the other. The Ardennes thus became more than a physical battlefield. They transformed into an involuntary laboratory of technology's psychic impact on human consciousness, a case study on how the psyche processes the encounter with the radically new through ancestral archetypal structures. As spring 1945 approached and Germany faced its inevitable defeat, the psychological legacy of proximity fuses in the Ardennes took on a new dimension. Interviews with captured German officers reveal a significant shift in their worldview. General Kurt von Liebenstein, in an interrogation conducted by American intelligence officers in April 1945, declared, "After the Ardennes, many of us understood that the war was truly lost. It wasn't just a matter of numbers or logistics. There was a technological chasm we could no longer ignore or overcome. It was as if a veil had been torn away." This statement evokes what Jung describes in Symbols of Transformation as the moment of recognition, when consciousness finally accepts a truth that the unconscious had long been processing. For many German officers, proximity fuses represented not only a military defeat, but a paradigmatic collapse. The revelation that the myth of German technological superiority, a fundamental pillar of Nazi propaganda, was fundamentally false. Studies conducted with Ardennes veterans in the following decades showed distinctive patterns of psychological trauma. Dr. Erich Fromm, a psychiatrist who treated hundreds of these men in the 1950s, observed, "There's a unique characteristic in these patients' nightmares. While veterans of other battles generally dream of human enemies or specific combat situations, Ardennes survivors frequently describe dreams where the environment itself, the sky, the trees, the air, becomes hostile and conscious. It's as if proximity-fused technology had merged in their unconscious with primordial natural forces." This clinical observation perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of archetypal inflation, when a traumatic experience amplifies an archetypal content to such an extent that it invades increasingly larger areas of consciousness. What began as the specific terror of one type of weapon gradually expanded, in the psyche of these men, to encompass their entire relationship with the natural world. A particularly intriguing phenomenon emerged among the German engineers and technicians who survived the war. Documents from Allied re-education programs show that many of these professionals developed an intense interest in radar and electronics technology after fully comprehending the functioning of proximity fuses. An American officer in charge of these programs wrote in his report, "It's almost as if they were trying to domesticate the monster that terrorized them, transforming it into something they could control and comprehend." Jung would recognize in this behavior a classic process of psychological integration, the attempt to transform a traumatic shadow content into a conscious tool available to the ego. For these engineers, mastering the technology that had symbolized their defeat represented a path to psychological healing and the reconstruction of a professional identity shattered by war. As technical knowledge about proximity fuses diffused in the post-war period, their symbolic impact didn't diminish, but transformed. In German military memoirs published in the 1950s and 60s, the air-bursting bombs frequently appear as a literary motif representing the moment of rupture, not just in the specific battle, but in the national narrative of technological progress and historical destiny itself. The writer and veteran Heinrich Gerlach, in his semi-autobiographical novel Explosion in the Void, 1958, uses proximity fuses as a central metaphor for the collapse of the Nazi worldview. It was in the forests of the Ardennes that the sky finally answered our arrogance, not with divine thunder, but with precisely calculated explosions that occurred in the void, as if the very mathematics of the universe were correcting our errors. This transformation of a physical weapon into a profound cultural symbol exemplifies what Jung calls the objectification of the archetype, the process by which intense psychic experiences crystallize into lasting cultural symbols that continue to shape collective consciousness long beyond the original event. In recently opened Soviet military archives, we discovered that Russian engineers extensively interviewed German prisoners from the Ardennes, fascinated by the psychological impact of proximity fuses. A report sent directly to Stalin in March 1945 recommended, "We must study not only American technology, but the effect it produces on the enemy's mind. Here lies a weapon more powerful than the explosive itself." Curious to learn more about how technological innovations transformed wars throughout history? Leave your comment below. We're preparing a series on the technological revolutions that forever changed the face of human conflict. For the German soldiers in the Ardennes, proximity fuses represented an encounter with what Jung would call technological otherness, the numinous and seemingly autonomous face of human creation when it surpasses the limits of common understanding. This encounter activated deep archetypal patterns related to the sky as the domain of the gods, fire as a transformative element, and the invisible as a source of primordial terror. Jung, in Psychology and Religion, explores how innovations that drastically challenge our understanding of reality often take on religious or mythical qualities in our psychic experience, exactly what we witnessed in the reactions of those soldiers. Decades after the end of World War II, the psychological echoes of the encounter with proximity fuses in the Ardennes continued to reverberate in German culture and the collective consciousness of veterans. A study conducted by the University of Hamburg in 1985 with battle survivors revealed that 43% still reported recurring dreams involving airbursts or hostile skies, an extraordinary testament to the permanence of these traumatic symbols in the psyche. Jung teaches us that experiences that cannot be completely integrated by consciousness continue to exist in the unconscious as autonomous complexes, manifesting through dreams, symptoms, and behavioral patterns throughout life. Proximity fuses became, for an entire generation of German soldiers, what we might call a technological complex, a core of traumatic experience that continued to influence their relationship with modernity and the very concept of progress. Particularly revealing is the work of German psychoanalyst Werner Kemper, who, in his book Collective War Traumas, 1972, documented a phenomenon he called technological anticipation anxiety among Ardennes veterans. These men frequently demonstrated disproportionate alarm reactions when confronted with new technologies in their civilian lives, from televisions to automated industrial machines. Kemper observed, "It's as if the original trauma had created a permanent hypersensitivity to the technological unknown. These patients frequently ask, facing any innovation, 'What does this machine know about me that I don't know about it?' This phenomenon perfectly illustrates the Jungian concept of continuous archetypal constellation, when an archetypal pattern, once strongly activated, remains sensitized and ready to be reactivated by similar stimuli throughout life. The original experience in the Ardennes had constellated the archetype of the technological observer, an invisible, superior, and potentially hostile presence embodied in mechanical devices. From a broader historical perspective, the impact of proximity fuses in the Ardennes represents a critical moment in humanity's relationship with its own creations. Military historian Howard Franklin argues in his study Technological Revolutions on the Battlefield, 1997, "In the Ardennes, we witnessed perhaps the first moment when a military technology surpassed not only the enemy's technical capability, but their very cognitive capacity to process it as reality. It was a psychological watershed as significant as the atomic bomb was a physical one." The final statistics are impressive. It's estimated that proximity fuses increased the effectiveness of Allied artillery by about 40% against troops in open fields and up to 60% against entrenched troops. But perhaps the most revealing number comes from German intelligence reports of the time. After 3 weeks of exposure to proximity fuses, the desertion rate among frontline units in the Ardennes increased by approximately 35%. Beyond the immediate military context, what happened in the Ardennes offers us a window into understanding a much broader phenomenon that Jung anticipated in his later writings: the growing disassociation between humanity's technological advancement and our psychological capacity to integrate that advancement meaningfully and equilibrate it. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung writes, Modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has estranged him from his deeper being and damaged him, just as he does not recognize what has been lost as a result of this estrangement. The German soldiers in the Ardennes faced, in an extreme and traumatic way, precisely this crisis of meaning. The moment when technology, supposedly the ultimate expression of human rationality, transforms into something numinous, incomprehensible, and seemingly endowed with its own will. Their experiences prefigure, in many ways, our own contemporary struggles to make sense of technological advancements that are increasingly complex and opaque in their operation. A quote from Carl Jung from his essay The Spirit in Art and Science perfectly captures the essence of this dynamic. When we become alienated from our own creation, it returns to us as a stranger, as something autonomous that we interpret as originating in the other. For the soldiers in the Ardennes, American technology had transformed precisely into this stranger, a human creation that, by transcending their comprehension, took on supernatural and numinous qualities. In this sense, their experience represents an extreme case of a process we all face in the modern world: the constant tension between creating increasingly complex technologies and preserving our ability to meaningfully integrate them into our worldview. If this video has brought a new perspective on the relationship between technology, psychology, and history, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Share it with friends interested in Jungian psychology or military history. We're just beginning to explore these fascinating intersections between the human psyche and decisive moments in history. What the German soldiers in the Ardennes experienced over 75 years ago remains profoundly relevant today. As artificial intelligence, automation, and increasingly complex algorithms permeate our daily lives, we often find ourselves in the same psychological position as those men in the snowy forests, confronted with technologies whose inner workings remain obscure, but whose effects on our lives are immediate and profound. Jung offers us not only a means to understand this phenomenon, but also a potential path to its resolution. In Psychology and Alchemy, he writes, "The integration of unconscious contents is a crucial act of recognition, not only of the content itself, but of the fact that we are both creators and creatures, both originators and subjects of forces that transcend our immediate comprehension." Perhaps the final lesson from the Ardennes is this: our relationship with the technology we create, be it proximity fuses or machine learning algorithms, fundamentally reflects our relationship with our own creative power and with the dimensions of our mind that remain, like the sky above those frozen forests, simultaneously familiar and profoundly mysterious.